Okay. All right, so thank you for coming. My name is Charlaine Mazzei. I am currently the Executive Director for the Del Norte Senior Center. Prior to that, I have been a consultant for probably 10 or 15 years now, doing grant writing, grant management, and a lot of troubleshooting. I've worked for several different agencies where they've had an issue and they've asked me to come in, clean it up, get it going, do that sort of thing. I started in human services with the Department of Health and Social Services at that time. I have a bachelor's degree in journalism from Humboldt State University and a master's in social work from Sacramento State. Sacramento State. So what this is about is nonprofit standards for excellence. And how this kind of came about is the Senior Center is funded by Community Services Block Grant funding. And that is something that I didn't know anything about until I got to the Senior Center. And it's a very unique allocation of funding from the federal government. It came from the 1964 War on Poverty, and it's been in effect in one way or another ever since then, but its focus is very, very broad, and it's on addressing the causes and effects of poverty in the country. And what's unique about it is each service area has its own agency that gets to do what its community needs. Now, in return for that, what the federal government asked us to do in the last probably 3 or 4 years that they've been talking about this, implementing it, talking about it much longer ago than that, is that we meet certain standards. And as I got to learn about the standards that the Community Services Block Grant Program was asking us to meet, I thought, this is good stuff for any nonprofit. These are simply best practices. And so when we formed the Nonprofit Alliance, one of the key things that we wanted to talk about was how do we strengthen the nonprofit sector? And this is one of the ways that we address that, is every nonprofit should be following best practices so that things don't go awry. And if you look back and look at the headlines in the community of nonprofits who have failed or almost failed, when you think about it, not one of them failed because of lack of funding. And that's what the focus is usually on, is how do we get funding, how do we get funding, how do we get funding? None of the nonprofits that have failed in recent history in Del Norte County failed because they did not have money. They failed because they weren't run according to best practices. And that ended up losing them the money that they had. So that's kind of where we are. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So what are organizational standards? And they can be called organizational standards. That's the terminology that I'm familiar with. They can also be called best practices. But what they are is a set of best practices that promote a strong and sustainable organization. And you hear that word an awful lot, is sustainability. Almost every funder asks, how are you going to sustain your program? And it isn't just about how are you going to find the money to run it after we go away. It's really how are you going to sustain your organization. Why standards? And I talked a little bit about that, but one of the reasons is internal accountability. If you know what you're looking for, especially as a board of directors, if you know what your executive director should be giving you at every board meeting, if you know the types of things that you should be seeing, then internally you know that you've got a good team going, you've got good programs, and things are working the way they're supposed to. The other reason is it focuses the governing board and management team on organization health and sustainability. It provides written direction for future governance. It also provides external confidence. Not only are you internally strong, but you can show the world that you have documented evidence of strength to a government agency or a foundational grantor. It also assures the local community donors that the money they're donating to you is being responsibly spent. And it also improves services, which is why we all do what we do, is to serve the community. So the standards that focus especially on client participation and on ongoing program evaluation ensure that services are meeting the community need. If you're just providing services and you never get any feedback from the people that you serve, you don't know if you're serving them well. So that's one of the standards is to have client participation. So governance is made up, and this is the board of directors role. Governance is made up, it's a fiduciary duty primarily. Your job as a board of directors is to make sure that the money is being taken care of properly. There's a duty of care, there's a duty of loyalty, and there's a duty of compliance. So you have a duty of care to take care of the money, you have a duty of loyalty as boards of directors to that organization and not to your own outside interests. And the duty of compliance, most money that you're going to get has some strings attached. If it's governmental funding, there's lots of strings, but even your private donations, they expect something from that money. And so you have a duty of compliance to whatever the funder that gave you that money is. So one of the standards is that you have a mission and vision statement. The governing board reviews the organization's mission and vision statements not less than every 5 years to ensure that the mission and vision statements accurately reflect the current goals of the organization. Are we still on track? The organization's programs and services align with the mission and vision statements. A lot of times you'll hear the term mission creep, and that tends to happen when you go after funding and you say, well, this isn't quite what we do, but we're going to go ahead and go after that money anyway because we need money. And then you go, okay, well, this one over here isn't quite what we do, but we're going to go for that too. And pretty soon you find you're doing funding and doing programs, and you look at your mission and vision and go, whoa, I'm a little bit off here. So examining your mission and vision statement, it doesn't mean that you don't want to go here. It means that you need to be intentional about it. Maybe it's time to update the mission and vision statement, or maybe it's time to rethink what money you're going after and get back to what you're originally formed for. Bylaws is another one where there are standards. The organization reviews and updates its bylaws not less than every 5 years. Best practices is for an attorney to review the organization bylaws. That can be tricky if you don't have a relationship with an attorney, but at the very least, you should be reviewing and updating your bylaws every 5 years to make sure that they match with how you're actually meeting. Do you have your quorum defined? Do you meet on the times that you say you do? And a lot of times, I review mine every year. We have an annual meeting every year, and the only way that we can amend bylaws is by a vote of the membership. So every year I take a look and say, well, is there anything that we need to update? And if there is, I bring it to the board, and then we bring it to the membership. So it's just making sure that your policies and practices are aligned with each other so that you don't get in trouble for getting off track. The organization should specify in its bylaws the number, type, and manner of selection of members of the governing board. So how do the people that run the place get elected? At least every 2 years, you should document that the governing members have received a copy of the current bylaws. It's amazing how many times I've found that organizations have bylaws, but nobody has seen them. They're on the shelf gathering dust somewhere. So it's important, especially as new members come on, that they get a copy of the bylaws, that everybody knows what you're supposed to be doing, and everybody's on the same page about it. The governing board documents that it meets in accordance with the frequency and quorum requirements of the organization's bylaws. So if your quorum says you need 50% plus 1, make sure you're not conducting business if you don't have 50% plus 1. If you need to change it and make your quorum something different because you have trouble getting people to meetings, then make that change in the bylaw. Don't just say, oh, well, we'll just do what we need to do. So board orientation and education. The organization has a process to provide a structured orientation for governing board members within 6 months of being seated. This is probably one of the toughest things to do. We are still working on ours. We're going to be developing it here in the next, hopefully the next 6 months, of how do you bring new board members on and make sure that they are coming into the culture of the organization and that they're not going to pull it in a direction that is different because of what they're bringing to the table. how do you get the history of the organization so that things live beyond individual members? So there's an orientation of here's what our mission and vision, here's what our bylaws are, here's what we're working on, here's our program philosophy, those kinds of things. So there should be some kind of an orientation. Each member of the governing board signs a conflict of interest policy before being seated and at least every 2 years thereafter. So conflict of interest is a big thing, especially in a community like ours. Everybody knows everybody, everybody's related to everybody. You have to make sure, again, this goes back to your loyalty is to the organization and not to your own personal interests. So you want to have a conflict of interest policy that says if you have an interest in something that is going to be before your governing body, a lot of times it'll be a service provision type of thing. You need to disclose that conflict of interest and you need to recuse yourself from voting on it if it's going to impact what you have. And that policy should be written, it should be signed by every member, and it should be updated every couple of years so that everybody's reminded that your loyalty is to the organization. Each governing member receives a copy of the organization bylaws. We talked about that a little bit before when we were talking about the bylaws, and at least every 2 years thereafter, or more frequently if amendments are made. So if they change, everybody gets a copy of the new bylaws once they're changed. Governing board members receive training on their duties and responsibilities at least every 2 years. A lot of people come onto boards and they're not quite sure what they're supposed to do. And so having that training of your board members are primarily responsible for the financial health of the organization. They're responsible for setting policy, and they're responsible for oversight of the executive officer. Some people call them CEOs, some people call them executive directors. Smaller boards that run their own program, they don't have staff, they still have that need to oversee as a group how the program's being implemented, what is it that you are doing, how is it being implemented. The governing board receives programmatic reports at each regular board meeting. That's really important, that there's documentation in the minutes that the board is being informed about how things are progressing. And it doesn't matter how big or how small you are, because the board acts as a group. It does not act as individual members. So even if you have an organization where the board members are primarily responsible for running the programs, you still have to get together and make decisions as a group. So that's very important that you get those reports. So risk assessment, this one is a whole basket all unto itself, but every organization should do a risk assessment. Organization-wide comprehensive risk assessment at least once every 2 years and report it to the governing board. If the board doesn't do it itself, then the staff that does it needs to report it to the board. And areas that covered can include a whole bunch of, so property and casualty, are you adequately insured? Are your employment practices compliant with law? Do you have adequate financial reporting and internal controls? Do you have the right contracts in place? Do you have safety for your clients and participants? Do you have emergency procedures in place? Do you have policies about vehicle use and transportation? Technology and privacy risk management, special events, crisis management, volunteer risk management, fundraising and resource development, and service delivery risks. Those are all topics that would be covered in a risk assessment. And again, a lot of people say, well, our organization is so small. How does this apply to us? Any nonprofit organization has these risks, no matter how big or how small. If you're an all-volunteer, you have volunteer risk management issues. Everybody needs property and casualty insurance. Even if you don't have volunteers, you still need to have volunteer employment practices. So every organization has something in here that applies to them. Strategic planning. This is something that a lot of organizations forget about, is that We get so into the day-to-day details of running the programs that we have that we forget to take a breath, step back, and look at the big picture. So again, these standards say that the organization has an agency-wide strategic plan in place. It has been approved by the governing board within the past 5 years. Some things that the plan should address is focusing on both medium and long-term planning as opposed to how am I going to get through next week. Addresses goals and objectives for the organization, its clients, and the community as appropriate. So depending on what kind of an organization you're running, your goals should address both how you want your organization, what do you want your organization to be when it grows up, its clients or the people that it serves, or the community as a whole. It should be informed by client satisfaction data, client input, and this says the community needs assessment. We are required every 2 years to do a comprehensive community needs assessment. But most organizations will at least be able to do client satisfaction data and get some sort of input from the people that they're serving. And that should inform your strategic planning. It should contain goals and objectives in keeping with your mission and vision statement. So this strategic planning is a good time to review the mission and vision statement. It should be reported on to the governing board no less than annually. The plan gets reported on. How are we doing on the plan? We had goals and objectives in the plan. How are we meeting them? Are we getting to where we thought we should go? If so, we can celebrate the success. If not, that's the time to talk about why not. Maybe it wasn't a good goal and we should adjust it a little bit. So executive selection and support, and this is for those organizations that have that executive officer. The selection, support, and oversight of the executive is one of the most important responsibilities of the governing board. And again, I have to remind my board not to trust me too much. Their job is to make sure that I am giving them the information that they need to independently decide if I'm doing a good job and if the organization is being successful. And what the other key to the failure of some of the nonprofits all over the place, and it isn't just here, is often an executive director that is either dishonest or not competent for the position. And people like to say, oh, but they were such a nice person. And being a nice person doesn't mean you're a good executive. So boards have to remember they get a lot of information through their executive, but they need to be able to tell if what that executive is telling them is independently verifiable by what documents they're being given at the board meetings. So it's good to have a written job description, clear expectation for experience and education, necessary to operate the organization on a day-to-day basis. It isn't always the next person in line. It isn't always, again, the nice person who's been there for a long time and ought to get promoted. You really need to know what does my executive need to know to run this organization, and make it very clear that that's what you're going to look for. The relationship between the executive, the board, and organization staff is clearly defined and discussed as part of board orientation and education. One of the things that I talk about a lot with boards is that the executive works for the board as a whole. Everybody else in the organization works for the executive. Board members are not supposed to be going around and supervising staff or telling staff what to do. That's the executive's role. If they want the executive to do something, as a group, again, they need to say, we would like you to do this with this program. But those roles should be clearly defined. A process for evaluating the effectiveness of the executive is in place. And this, I will reveal one of my personal biases on this. I hate written evaluations. I hate them, hate them, hate them. I don't like getting them. I don't like doing them. I think they can be counterproductive. That doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a process in place for the board to say, is the executive doing a good job? It could be as simple as saying during the board meeting, we usually do it once a year around budget time, we talk about the compensation and we talk about, you know, what am I doing that you'd like me to do different? And I will do that at every meeting. I'll say, what am I doing that you'd like me to do different? What am I doing? Well, what could I improve on? So there should be something. That is part of the board's responsibility, is to oversee the executive. A process for establishment and discussion of the executive compensation is in place. This tends to come from the really big nonprofits that executive director compensation becomes a big deal when you're talking about like the American Red Cross or United Way of America, where they're making lots of money and people start asking questions about, well, why are they making so much money and where is all the donations going? But it still needs to be the board deciding. It's not the executive deciding, well, I'm going to just give myself a raise and I'm going to go tell the accountant to pay me more. It has to be discussed by the board, and that compensation has to be approved by the board. The organization has a written succession plan in place for the executive director approved by the governing board, which contains procedures for covering both an emergency, unplanned short-term absence of 3 months or less. When I first started, I got bit by a dog. I was in the hospital for a week, came home with a cast on my arm. How are you going to deal with that? Who's going to step in? Who's going to run the place while the executive's out? As well as the process for filling a permanent vacancy. So one of your best things, if you can, if you're large enough, if you have a good enough staff, is to have somebody within the organization that can step in to help the ED if the ED has to be gone. That is your best bet, because that person hopefully knows how the organization is running. And they should be able to step in and do the day-to-day stuff. This is something that most boards need to know. The board president acting as an interim ED is not a succession plan. This happens all the time. But there are a couple reasons that you don't want this to be your succession plan. First of all, board presidents come on to boards for reasons other than their ability to run an organization. And the bigger the organization, the more complex it is, the less likely it is that you're going to have a board president at that time that the executive director is absent that is going to have the knowledge to run that organization. The second reason is they probably already have a job. Yes, we have retired board members, but a lot of the time we have board members who have other jobs that they have to pay attention to. And the executive director position is something that needs to be focused on. It needs to be their only focus for that time. Again, volunteer-run organizations are a little bit different. And this part of the executive selection and support is most often for those organizations that actually have an executive director. But it's the organization will struggle if you don't get someone in there who is dedicated to running, even on an interim basis, that's dedicated that their job is to run the organization and make sure that it stays on track. So program planning, implementation, and evaluation. This is another section. So most of that first section was on board governance. This is on program planning, implementation, and evaluation. So this moves into what do we do, what is our purpose, and how do we measure whether we're doing a good job at it. So client participation is a big one. That's a very big best practice. Whoever you're serving, you need to get feedback from them. So there should be a way that you systematically collect, analyze, and report data collected from clients, the governing board, and let me start that one over. She told me not to screw up, and then I did. So the organization systematically collects, analyzes, and reports data collected from clients to the governing board and management team, which uses that information to plan, implement, and evaluate program services. So that's the standard. So it can be a client pre-service needs assessment. So a client comes in and you do a needs assessment. What is it that you need? And again, a lot of these are from a human services perspective, but even if you're serving the community. For example, if you're doing performances for the community, you still have an audience. So you may do a survey for your audience of how do you like what we did. Client post-service satisfaction surveys. So that's going to be the most often. Do you like the shows that we're putting on? What kind of shows would you like to see? Focus groups. You can bring people into a room and ask them questions about, are you aware of what we do? What do you think about it? What do you like? Advisory committees. A lot of organizations will have a standing advisory committee. We have a couple that we use that get together on a regular basis, and we have one that gives input on our nutrition program menus and on events that we're going to do at the center and special parties. So that advisory committee gives us input on what we should be doing. Client membership on the governing board. I have an asterisk next to this because sometimes that's a good idea, sometimes it's not. So we have clients on the senior center board. We have a partnership with the Redwood Cove Senior Apartments that are behind the senior center. They're a separate board. We have decided that having residents on that governing board is not a good idea because they will go back over to the apartments and say, well, I'm on the board, so you have to do this, this, and this. And we've had some not good experiences. So we have a tenant advisory committee. That's how the input gets to the board. So that is something that each individual organization needs to talk about. Some funding sources require this, depending on what your program is, but that's why I have an asterisk on that. There should be a grievance or a complaint process. If you're providing a service, especially for those of us that provide financial assistance type services or something where if the client doesn't get what they think they should get, they're going to be upset. There has to be a grievance process that they can follow to get their grievance heard. Suggestion box. Have a box out where you go, have people be able to put suggestions in it. So those are all just ideas for how you can get that engagement from the people you serve. Community engagement. So that's the clients that you directly serve. Then there's the broader community that may not participate in your services, but you still want to engage them. So the organization engages with the broader community through partnerships and collaborative activities to assess community needs and resources, implement services, and report activities and results. So participating in the development of a community-wide needs assessment. This is a real kind of a pet thing for me. I have been working in human services in Del Norte County for a lot of years, and we have done a needs assessment for this. And we go out and we look at the strengths and weaknesses, and we look at the resources and the needs and the gaps, and we do that for this project over here. And then I'll be on another group that's working on something else, and we do a needs assessment, and we go out and we look at the resources, and we look at the strengths, and we look at the weaknesses, and we look at the missing pieces. And lo and behold, it's the same information that we got over here. And then I'll come in and have to do the same thing for every individual project. Almost every funding source out there these days wants you to show that your community needs whatever it is you're asking for. We have to do it as a community services block grant agency. We have to do a comprehensive needs assessment every 2 years. My goal is to get all of the nonprofits to help participate with that and then give it out to everybody and say, here, you guys can use this information that we all collected for whatever it is you need. 2 years from now, we'll come back together and we'll do it all at once so that we don't have to do all these little piecemeal ones and reinvent the wheel. So that's what I mean by participating in the development. Nobody should have to do it all on their own. Participate in coalitions like the Nonprofit Alliance, the Food Council, the Family Assistance Network, the Child Abuse Prevention Council, whatever coalitions there are that sort of meet the needs of your organization. Again, the whole idea is that we're in this together. We're all in this community. We're all working to better the community. Let's do it together and not try to do it all on our own. Utilize community volunteers in the provision of service. Almost all of us do that. to one degree or another. So that's another great way to get the community engaged in what we're doing. So service plan. The organization has an outcome-based service plan that ties to the community needs assessment and is consistent with the mission and vision statements. So everything ties together. So everything gets informed by your mission and your vision, and it gets informed by what your community says it needs from you. And it doesn't have to be complicated. A lot of people think that these things have to be really super complicated. And so I've got an example. This is our community service plan that we turn into the state. What is our need? What came out of the community assessment that says our need is it a priority for our agency? Sometimes the priority is a no, because we just don't have the resources to meet the need. It's not within our wheelhouse, so it may not be your priority. How are you going to address that need? And how are you going to coordinate with other people to get it done? That's as simple as it needs to be. But it should be there so that it's in writing, you can take a look at it, see where you are with it, and again, show it to other potential funders to say, here's what we're working on, how can you help me? Okay. So a results-based evaluation system is a big circle, and this is kind of a continuous thing, and some people do it instinctively. They see something, they try to do something, it didn't work, they change the way they do it. And other people, they want it more formal. So basically, it uses, the organization should utilize a continuous results-based cycle to evaluate program effectiveness. And that consists of assessment, planning, implementation, results. So you look for results equal outcomes for the clients. And it's a very simple question. Were people better off for having been involved with our organization or our services? That's your driving force. Are people better off because of what we're doing? And then you evaluate those outcomes. Did we achieve what we thought we were going to achieve? Yes, we did. Great, what do we do next? No, we didn't. Let's talk about what we need to do differently and do more planning, do more implementation, look at your results. So it's kind of an ongoing process that kind of becomes ingrained in the way that you do business. Reporting, and a lot of times when you see reporting, you think of reporting to your funder. If you have a funder that requires, almost all of them require some kind of report, but there's a lot of different kinds of reporting that can be done. So the governing board and the community receive updates on organization activities, services, and program outcomes, not less than annually. So you've got your funder reporting, but you also need reporting to the board. How are you doing? You need reporting to the community. The community wants to know how you're doing. So regular reports during board meetings, that goes back to the program reports that we talked about earlier. The organization annual report. Every organization should have some kind of little annual report that talks about your programs, your outcomes, and your financial position. Report activities to the community, and these are all the different ways that you can do it through an annual report. Your website is a way of reporting to the community what you're doing. News releases and social media. Human resources. This is another chunk that even if you are an all-volunteer organization or you are a kind of the board does everything kind of organization, there are still going to be pieces of this that you should think about. This presentation is meant for the larger organizations that actually have employees, so there's going to be a lot of talk about personnel manuals and that sort of thing. But if you think about personnel manual, if you're an all-volunteer organization, you need to have a volunteer manual. If you think about job descriptions, even if you're a volunteer organization, you should have volunteer job descriptions. It saves a lot of headaches with people not understanding what they're supposed to be doing. So personnel policies, or think volunteer policies. The organization has written personnel policies that have been reviewed by an attorney and approved by the governing board within the past 5 years and which are made available to all staff. Again, the attorney review can be challenging sometimes, but it's best practices. A lot of times, if you are and I think I have this in a slide somewhere. And I'll make my plug for NIAC, the Nonprofit Insurance Alliance. They offer directors and officers insurance, and they do some liability insurance. But they are a nonprofit. They are designed exclusively for nonprofits, and there's a lot of value-added services that come along with your insurance coverage. And one of those services is access to a human resources attorney. They won't review your personnel policies, I asked, but they will answer personnel questions. How do I terminate this person without getting sued? How do I discipline this person? How do I do, what should my employment agreement look like? Those kinds of things. So I have a plug for them somewhere in here, but personnel policies, one of the reasons that I say that is because the handbook builder that we used for our personnel policies is a discounted subscription because we're a member of NIAC. So the organization regularly notifies staff of changes. Again, if what you do has to be in writing. What you have written has to be what you do. If you're going to change what you do, you need to change the writing and make sure everybody knows about it. And that's really important when you're dealing with employees or volunteers, is to make sure that you have informed them this is what your expectations are. Written acknowledgement of receipt of the handbook and all changes is kept on file for every staff person. They don't have to read it, but you have to say you got it. And then they can't come back and say, well, you never told me about this. You never told me I couldn't take money from my client. You never told me I couldn't, have a relationship with my client. Those kinds of things. So personnel policies should include a whistleblower policy. And this is something that we are required to do for our federal funding, but it's also good practice. That it should encourage individuals to come forward with credible information on legal or policy violations. And most importantly, it specifies that they will be protected from retaliation. You want people to come to you and say, hey, this isn't right. You don't want them to be afraid that they're going to get retaliated against. So there should be a policy in place that says, if you come and tell us that there's fraud happening in this program, we're not going to fire you because you told us about fraud. Identifies the staff, board members, or outside parties for reporting. So a lot of times your policy will say report to this person unless this person is who you're concerned about, and then you need to go to this person over there. So they should have avenues so that they can't say, well, you never told me, I was worried about my boss and the policy says I have to report it to my boss and I can't do that. It's like, well, you've got an alternative. So a handbook building service, the Thompson handbook builder, I believe it's not Thompson anymore. I think they changed the platform, but it's still, what it does, it's a template, and you sit down and you fill in the template and it gives you suggested policies. You tell them how many people you employ, and it will automatically pull up the policies that apply to that size organization. And you can craft it how you want, you can make changes how you want, and it helps you to make sure you've addressed all the issues, because personnel is kind of a hairy, complicated thing to deal with, so it's best to have some sort of guidance along the way. So job descriptions. This applies whether you are an an agency that employs people or an agency that has all volunteers. You should have job descriptions, written job descriptions for all positions. They should have been reviewed and updated in the last 5 years. They should include the job title, the reporting relationship, who they report to, summary, job duties, supervisory responsibilities if they have any, minimum education and work qualifications, working conditions, any key essential qualities or physical abilities to perform the job. And a lot of the terminology is with or without reasonable accommodation. So you may have to read, but if you can read if you need accommodation to read and it's reasonable, then you say with or without accommodation, you need to be able to read. And employee acknowledgement, and signed acknowledgements are kept in each employee's file. Again, that's so that they can't come back later and say, well, you never told me that this was part of my job. A new employee orientation. is important. The organization has a process in place to orient new employees to the organization and to job duties within 60 days of hire. May include mission and history of the organization, timekeeping procedures, job description and performance inspections, a safety orientation, harassment prevention training, orientation to the handbook. You're going way too fast. And a facility tour and staff introductions. So it's, it's good, again, that you have some kind of systematic way of orienting either your staff or your employees. It's very easy to hire somebody, we're all busy, we're all stretched, and oh my gosh, we finally got somebody in this position, go to work. And we forget that they kind of need to get their feet under them and understand what kind of an organization they're coming into, meet the people they're going to be working with. So it's good to have some kind of a written, systematic process to do that for people.
Okay.
Now I'm ready. Employee evaluation. The organization has a policy in place to provide periodic evaluation of employee performance. This could be the traditional written annual evaluation. It could also be employee goal setting and coaching notes. So if you meet with your employees every so often and say, what are your goals? What do you want to work on? What do you think you're doing well? When you sit down and coach an employee or a volunteer on something, you can make notes in their file that they've done that. That's the way I prefer to do it, is that you have evaluation should be an ongoing thing. It shouldn't be this big stress-filled, every year I have to sit down and somebody's going to grade me on what I do. You should be giving feedback and getting feedback all through the year, and the same goes for good or things that need to be improved. Performance improvement plans, progressive discipline policies. We use a progressive discipline policy. We will use the performance improvement plans if someone is really seriously in need of kind of a wake-up call when we've tried to do the coaching. So that's another way that you can do that. Ongoing feedback on job performance, reward and recognize positive performance. This is hard for a lot of us. If things are going really well, we tend to not focus on that as much as when things go kind of haywire. So this is something to remember. How do you reward and recognize positive performance when people are doing really well? Congratulations, way to go. Training and professional development. And this is something that you really have to make an effort in this area to find for people. But if you can provide opportunities for staff or volunteers to access training and professional development to improve their job performance and their skill set, that's always a good thing for your organization. So financial management, this is another, I believe this is the last set of standards, but this is very important, especially for members of boards of directors. Annual audit or financial review. The organization has an outside review or formal audit of its financial statements conducted by a CPA at least annually. And this is one that a lot of smaller organizations will say, well, we can't afford an audit, and I understand that. Larger organizations can't afford an audit either. They're expensive. But just having someone who is not part of the organization, who knows what financial statements are supposed to look like, doing a review of your financial statements every year is something that ought to be done. Because you can catch things that are haywire if someone from outside comes in and looks at it. So there should be something. Federally funded organizations have to comply with this Title II, Part 200. It's called Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements. A lot of people call it the Super Circular. It used to be Circular A133. It's basically the rules that the federal government says, if you receive federal funding, thou shalt do this depending on how much funding you get. Non-federally funded organizations should at least have an outside CPA conducting a review. And that is to ensure that the information that's being presented from the board to the board of directors, the public and outside funders is free from what they call material misstatements. And that means that something is really wrong with how your finances are being reported. Findings from prior audits or reviews are assessed and addressed by the organization's governing board and executive management. So if somebody comes along and does an audit or does a review and says, hey, by the way, you've got these issues that you should deal with, there should be documentation in the follow-up board meetings that says you address those issues that you should have dealt with. And the audit or review is presented to the governing board by the auditor reviewer, and the audit review is formally accepted by the governing board. And this is something that's important. The auditor or the person who did the review should be the one coming to the board and presenting the review, if at all possible. Again, it's a check and a balance, that if everything that the board hears is coming through the executive officer or through one board member, that's a problem. You shouldn't be afraid to have someone from the outside come and present to the board, and that should verify what you're seeing from your executive director in your reports every month. I don't know if you remember that about 7 or 8 years ago, the senior center had a very big problem with fraud, abuse in its energy program. It almost lost, well, it did lose the program for 2 or 3 years, and it almost ended up losing the whole thing. And part of that was because there was very little oversight of the executive director, and in that particular case, the problem was found by virtue of an audit. So they don't always find everything, but it really is important to have that outside voice to tell you that, if something's kind of hinky. Tax information and filing compliance. Most 501c3s have some sort of filing that they have to do with the federal government and the state of California. Most of them have to do their 990s. If you have employees, you have to file your payroll tax reports on time. So all of that stuff needs to be done, and information filings have to be caught up and not late, and the right amounts and all of that sort of thing. The organization's payroll withholding filings and payments are made timely. The organization's IRS Form 990 is completed annually, made available to the governing board for review. That doesn't always happen in a lot of cases. The accountant or whoever does the 990 files it, sits on a shelf, the board doesn't really see it. So the board should be looking at it. A lot of boards don't like to see all the financial stuff, but that's their job. They're supposed to be looking at that. An incorporated organization completes and files an annual corporation statement of information with the Secretary of State. That gets forgotten a lot. I've forgotten that a couple of years. Completes an annual filing with the Department of Justice Registry of Charitable Trusts. That's another one that can easily be forgotten. Budget. So the governing board annually approves an organization-wide budget. And if you have programs, individual programs in your organization, there should also be budget information for those individual programs. So we run 4 or 5 distinct programs in our organization. And I will give a budget for each one of those programs, and then I give my board an overall budget that rolls them all up into one. It's a lot of paper, it's a lot of numbers, but it gives everybody a chance to see, okay, our nutrition program, here's where the money comes from, here's what we're going to spend it on. Energy program, here's where the money comes from, here's what we're going to spend it on. And then they have the overall budget. For smaller organizations, it's much simpler. It usually is just an overall budget. Budget should be detailed enough to show where the funds are coming from and where they will be spent. All revenue and expense lines should be accounted for. Governing board financial reports. So you have your budget. Every board meeting after you've adopted a budget, you should be getting reports. So they should receive financial reports at each regular meeting that include the following. At minimum, according to most standards, you should be getting an organization-wide report on revenue and expenditures that compares budget to actual. Here's your budget, here's what we spent so far, are we on track? And a balance sheet or statement of financial position, some people call it that, so that you know as a snapshot, here's how the accounts receivable I have, here's the accounts payable I have, here's what my detailed report of checks written for the period since the last report was presented. So I will give my board a list of all the checks that we wrote for the prior month. I also give them a detailed report of credit account transactions for the period since the last report was presented. And one reason that I do that, and I recommend that that be done, most of the fraud and abuse that was happening at the senior center before I got there was happening through the use of a credit card. And all the board ever saw was a lump sum payment on the credit card. So there was never an accounting for what transactions were included on that credit account. So I give them not only the check that we wrote to the credit card company, but I give them each individual transaction that made up that check. And then an overall profit and loss statement for the period since the last report was presented. So you've got your year-to-date report, which talks about how you're doing from the beginning of your fiscal year to wherever you are. But I also like to show them, here's what our profit and loss was for September, so that they kind of know and can see from one month to the next what you're doing. So those are kind of the additional ones that I like to put. So organizations should have fiscal policies in place. Has written fiscal policies that have been reviewed by staff within the past 2 years, updated as necessary with changes approved by the governing board. Federally funded organizations must, and all organizations should have policies addressing the following. Records retention and destruction. Most federal contracts have records retention requirements attached to them, but you should have something that says we're going to keep our records for X number of years. 3 years is usually about what the federal requirements are. 3 to 5 years is probably about right. Procedures for handling money received, making purchases, paying bills and invoices. Procedures for determining the allowabilities of costs and allocation of shared costs. And this again is for larger organizations that run multiple programs. If you have a cost that benefits all the programs, there has to be a logical way to share that cost out over the programs. So there has to be a written plan for how to do that. Conflict of interest, again, this comes up everywhere. Conflict of interest, how do you deal with serving relatives in your program? How do you deal with if my cousin Mike is the one that provides our propane to us? How do you do that? How do you minimize those conflicts? How do you say, you know, again, the loyalty is to the organization, not to your outside interest. Maintaining property records. You buy something, especially your kind of fixed asset kind of stuff. You buy a car, you buy a filing cabinet, you buy a desk. How do you keep track of that? What's your inventory process? Procurement of goods and services. This is a huge one for federally funded organizations. There are federal requirements for how you're supposed to go out and buy stuff. You're supposed to get bids. You're supposed to, depending on the dollar amount you're going to spend, the bidding requirements become more and more stringent as you are planning on spending more money. But there should be a policy that says, hey, we're going to go out and try to find the best price we can. And again, we're not just going to buy it from Mike down the road because he's my cousin. If Mike has the best price, that's great. But you have to show that you did the research and found out that Mike has the best price. Travel reimbursement. How are you going to reimburse people for travel? What rates are you going to use? Are you going to use the standard federal mileage rate if people go out of town? If you have a company car, do you have a policy that says you have to use the company car unless it's not available, and then you can use your personal auto? How are you going to do all that? What rates for meals are you going to have? Fringe benefits. This is something if you offer health insurance, if you offer retirement, how does that all work? Who's eligible? When are they eligible? Nowadays, every employer in the state of California has to offer sick pay, at least 3 days. So how does that get into writing? And then claiming of contracted funds. Every funder has a different way of you reporting to them that I spent your money, now you need to either credit me for that what you gave me up front, or you need to give me the money now that I've already spent it. So there should be procedures in place, policies and procedures in place that say how are you going to do that. Yes, separation of duties. Whenever money is involved, at least 2 sets of eyes should be on the process at as many points as is possible. And this is not only for the organization's protection, it's for the protection of the people who are dealing with the money. If you have cash and only one person is counting it, and only one person is taking it to the bank, and only one person is making the reports to the board, that one person is at huge, huge risk if something comes up missing. To have 2 people count the money, a different person, if you can, who takes the money to the bank. We have to do, small organizations have to do some kind of convoluted stuff in order to get enough eyes on things. But the more places in the process that you can get 2 sets of eyes or more on something, the better off you're going to be, both for your own protection, so there's less chance of people with sticky fingers, but also there's less chance of and I say this to my employees all the time, it's not that I don't trust you, it's that I don't want to put you in the position of if something comes up wrong, you're the only one that had any access to this. So that's really important. So that is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, and where we go from here, there's a lot of directions we can go, but does anybody have any questions about any of this? It's a lot.